ICS, the Incident Command System, is a standard for emergency management in the US, which has been espoused by FDA for response to food safety or public health adverse events. I am your TAG Talks host, Lisa Lupo, and today I'm talking with TAG Vice President of Public Health and Regulatory Affairs, Ben Miller, about ICS and its application to public health and food safety events. Good afternoon, Ben.
Hi, Lisa.
So, to get us all started, can you discuss just what ICS is and how it applies to food safety and public health?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started my career in public health and food safety, it was in the state government side of the world. And in the mid 2000s, we started to look at what are better ways to respond to foodborne outbreaks. And so the incident command system was a tool that had been used and developed actually back in the 1970s by the wildland fire community. So back when they had the wildland forest fires, they needed a system to coordinate a lot of resources that were kind of just in time or needed to respond to fires and then emergencies. That system had been developed then by law enforcement and kind of the fire community over the last 30 years, and it started to make its way into other corners of government. And so we used it as a structure and a process to respond to sort of non-normal events, sort of what we would call an all hazards response. So that might include things like human foodborne illness outbreaks. It might include animal related outbreaks like an avian influenza outbreak, where you need to coordinate just in time sort of a lot of resources because you're responding to something that is outside of normal operations, with you will. And that's why we think about it in terms of an all hazards response. You know, when COVID started, what we saw in working with some of our clients within the food industry in particular was that a lot of people had response plans in place and even had pandemic preparedness response plans in place. And those plans, well thought out, really tended to focus on how do I respond to an influenza pandemic? Well, we quickly learned that COVID wasn't influenza, both in terms of the way that it was transmitted and its transmissibility, but also just in terms of what was available to us at the time in terms of personal protective equipment like masks and gloves and improved ventilation and the things that we've learned really reduces the risk of COVID transmission overall. And so now, coming out of the pandemic about 2 years later, we thought this was a good time to revisit this topic and think about, well, what's next as we plan for the next pandemic or maybe the next unforeseen event. How do we develop a process rather than a plan to put people in a good place to be able to respond to whatever that unforeseen event is?
So why is it important to have a process instead of just a response plan?
Again, when we think about plans, what we tend to do is we write based on the experience that we had for the last disaster that we responded to. So in the case of COVID, if we were going to go back and write a pandemic preparedness response plan, we might think about, okay, well, how do we make sure that we have enough masks on hand, or how do we make sure that we have enough testing available, or what are some of the things that we need to be able to immediately respond if our workforce isn't able to come into work? And well, those things are important and can certainly carry through depending on what the situation is. If people build a process, they're much more able to respond to sort of the unknown in the moment. And one of the things that the incident command system does is it defines roles very clearly within a command structure. So you have somebody who's considered the incident commander, they're in charge of the response. Then you have other positions that support that. So you have somebody who's in charge of operations and somebody who's in charge of logistics, and most importantly, planning and finance as well. So you were able to bring a lot of disciplines together, disciplines that are needed to respond again to a pandemic, but also that could be used to respond to, let's say, if you had a fire within a food processing facility, you can use the incident command system to essentially bring the right group of people together in order to formulate a rapid and effective response. So it's about building a group that can work through a process, almost really regardless of what the issue is, in a timely manner. The other important thing that it does is it allows people to identify alternatives or backups to key roles within the organization. One thing that we saw with COVID was that, 2 or 3 or 4 people within an organization got tasked with essentially overseeing that response. And there wasn't always backup within companies or organizations, so that, if somebody was out, if they got sick themselves or just needed to take a few days off, that sometimes caused issues. And so looking at a structure like the incident command structure, one of the key pieces is to also identify backups to these key positions, so that, if somebody does need to go out, if they get sick themselves, or that they just need to take a break, that you've clearly identified somebody who can step into a well-defined process and kind of keep the ball moving down the field. And it's less dependent then on specific individuals to make sure that that response is both effective and sustainable in the long run.
So as a business, what can I do to learn more about developing a ICS structure and even applying it in my business?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the good news is that there's a lot of resources and training that are available for free just online. So if people are curious about getting some familiarity with the incident command system, they can go to the FEMA website, the Federal Emergency Management Association or agency's website, and just do a Google search for ICS 100 or 200. And there you can sign up and take those courses online for free. And that gives you some sense of really what's involved in terms of setting up an incident command system. And I think the important thing to know is that that system can be customized depending on what people need. What you'll see in those trainings tends to be, again, more focused like on law enforcement and firefighter response, but the concepts can be adapted to a business setting, or in the case of my previous regulatory experience, food inspection or outbreak investigation work. And in fact, FDA had recognized that, the incident command system is a tool that they use when they respond to outbreaks as well. One of the nice things too about at least gaining some familiarity with that system is that when you're interacting with government agencies, if we're in the context of an outbreak or just even a natural disaster, that your company and your team has some familiarity with the nomenclature or the language that the government agencies may be using to formulate their response. So those are some initial steps. I think a couple other important points are, you could reach out to us at TAG, if you feel like this might be a good approach or something that you're interested in developing within your organization. So moving again from a crisis response plan to a crisis response process, we can help develop and customize that based on kind of the internal resources that you have, and help you put together what that looks like on paper, but also practice it, in the form of tabletop or functional exercises. And that, people are probably familiar with conducting mock recall exercises. You can do something very similar with this type of program and approach, and we can develop hypothetical scenarios where you're responding to those scenarios using that incident command structure. Probably one of the most important things, just in my experience in working with the system, the incident command system, is that you're only as good as you are in terms of practicing it. So if you find ways to build it into your regular crisis management and response system, you find that you're able to more effectively respond to the big one whenever that one happens, so that you have people that are familiar with the terminology, they're familiar with what that process looks like, they know how it should flow and function. So that's one of the big learnings that I think came out of our work with it when I was at the state of Minnesota, was practicing it on an ongoing basis. And so anytime we would have, a food recall or a food outbreak that we were working on, we might create an incident command structure, even if it only involved 2 or 3 people, just to develop that practice. So that's, I think, an important piece to consider when you're thinking about, is this the right way that I want to approach thinking more about an all hazards approach to crisis management and response within my organization.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ben. I think that's a great overview of what the ICS system is, and how it can be used in businesses today. We hope that this has provided our audience with some really key insights, and know that you can call on Ben or any of our tag experts at any time for more information and assistance. And be sure to click subscribe to stay up to date on all things food safety and public health from tag experts. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Lisa.